Welcome back, everybody. This is Lecture 24, Gothic Art and Architecture in France. A lot of architectural examples in this particular section, so that's our main focus here. So remember that the Kingdom of France at one time had been the heart of the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, and that territory had reduced and reduced and reduced under Otto and his successors and until the current timeline that we're in right now. The Romanesque era was the first major architectural flowering in Western Europe that we studied, and we're now looking at the subsequent style, the Gothic style, and that subdivides into early and high, and then into a couple of pretty dramatic styles, the Rayonnant style and what we call the flamboyant style. So I'm not going to test you on the dates of those individual divisions between this. They do overlap a little bit, but just try to remember that we go from kind of early Gothic, which transitions us from Romanesque to High Gothic, to a pretty elaborate style called Rayonnant, and then to an absolutely over-the-top style called flamboyant, and you'll definitely recognize the differences, I think. The Gothic style can be easily told apart from the Romanesque style because the Gothic arches are pointed as opposed to round. So that's the key thing to look for. We definitely are pretty familiar by this point with the different parts of the cathedral. Obviously, if you're in the nave, not looking at the apse, but looking toward the aisle, you know that you can differentiate the sections of what we call the nave elevation. The division between the nave and the side aisles, which is arches and columns, that's the nave arcade. Above that area, often we have the gallery. That will start to fall away, Gothic style. The triforium may remain, but the clerestory, the window section, will become larger and larger and larger. So remember that gallery may be the part that is disappearing. The Romanesque churches, usually we saw a 2- or 3-part elevation. In the early Gothic, you're going to see all 4 parts, and then you'll start seeing a reduction down to just a 3-part elevation. The gallery, of course, is that second level where you can look in between these columns into the nave. The triforium is a blind arcade. There's a flat wall behind that, so no space for people really behind there. The clerestory, of course, is the window section. Remember your vaulting systems. The round arch is the barrel vault. When 2 of intersect at 90-degree angles, it creates the groin vault. We can increase the structural capability of that vaulting system with the ribbing. So in this case, we have transverse ribs that go straight across the aisle or across the bay. Here we have diagonals creating this X shape, and that divides this vaulting into 4 parts, a quadro-type system. More frequently now, we're going to start seeing the 6-part system or sex-part type vault. The webbing, again, is the stonework, the masonry in between the ribbing. On occasion, you will see 7-part vaulting. We saw that in England in Durham Cathedral. And then I just wanted to give you a visual guide. Taller and taller and taller and taller. We'll look at some of the early Gothic examples. Lyon Cathedral has a gallery and a triforium. You can see there are all 4 parts. There's our gallery, the nave arcade at the bottom, the gallery above that, then the triforium, then the clerestory windows. In Notre Dame, as we move into the High Gothic, we're going to get rid of the gallery. Instead, we'll have the nave arcade, the triforium, and then a large area for windows. That's our clerestory here in Notre Dame. And you notice that the height difference from Notre Dame to Chartres is only about 5 feet on the interior, but the churches are getting taller and taller. Chartres Cathedral also is going to be without gallery. We've got our nave arcade, our triforium, and then windows. In this case, 2 lancet windows and 1 large circular ox window that you see above here. Amiens Cathedral does the same thing, so does Amiens, and they just get larger and larger and taller and taller and taller. This is that same elevation comparison that we were just looking at. In this case, we can look at here Notre Dame in Paris. You can recognize Notre Dame at its initial elevation using these circular elements for the windows below the lancets. 2 is Chartres Cathedral, 3rd is Rome, and 4 is Amiens. You can see that the churches, as we develop through the Gothic, get taller and taller. So why does any of this matter? Well, of course, we're trying still to attract people to come to these churches to venerate the relics of saints. That's also driving economics as well as the power of the municipalities and the power of the church. So we want to increase people's interest in coming to these churches, and the way to do that really is to make them more impressive, to keep making them larger and more decorative. And so as that kind of cathedral building craze happens through the 1200s, you're going to start seeing a change from the post and lintel system we were used to in Greece, change to the round arch system we got used to in Rome, and then into the Romanesque. But you can see that if I want to build a taller roof or taller ceiling here using a round arch, if it is a perfect half circle, to make it taller, I have to push those two sidewalls further and further apart. So eventually your church gets far wider than you want it to be visually to make that elegant cross shape. We still want to keep it narrow, but we want to keep it tall. The other issue is that a round arch tends to push not just downward, but the weight is carried out to the sides. So the walls that support these have to be massively thick. So a decision in architectural terms was made to try to keep things narrow but tall, going instead of the round arch, going for a pointed arch. It allows you to keep the narrow verticality, extreme height, but now of course this makes this building a little susceptible to falling apart. The pointed arch is going to drive a lot of the weight straight down into the original posts, into the piers that are directly beneath it, but it will be easy to push over or to damage. A lot of this weight needs to be distributed further out to kind of increase the base or the footprint. And so that leads us to the additions of these supports. You can imagine the weight now coming down to this point, some of the weight being carried here and some of it being carried here. It's going to make the building more stable. So we call these our flying buttresses, this element that literally just exists on the outside to support the thing. But since we have this kind of exoskeleton now to support the cathedrals, we can put more and more glass in there. We don't need as much support from the wall itself. We can now pierce the walls with more and more windows. So we'll see that happening more and more. You definitely will see a continuation of the use of the cross shape, usually the Latin cross where the descending element is longer. We definitely still have rounded apses and often lots of radiating chapels at this end. Quite frequently, altar is either at the crossing or right here so that the pilgrims can go around the ambulatory behind without disturbing the services in the center. It's not unusual for there to be a lot of decorative stained glass both at the west, which is your entrance, and north and south. There are also entrances on the transept arms, and then an enormous amount of glass here in the ambulatory around the radiating chapels as well. The elevation that you start to see changing quite a bit as we go forward. You want to definitely pay attention to whether or not there's a gallery and what's going on with the clerestory windows. Remember, this view is a cutaway section, so we're seeing just the left half of the church. This area is the nave, so that would continue off your screen. So you have two side aisles in this case. So here's your exterior roof, really, here and here, which explains why the windows have to be so much higher. And this gives us our flying buttresses, which are going to help to support the building by literally pushing on it from the outside. That is definitely a step forward as we move to the first true Gothic church in France. It was not designed by, but designed to the specifications of, verbal specifications and requests of Abbot Suger. So he did not actually do the architectural mathematical work himself, but he knew what he wanted to happen, and he wanted to change a church that had been in this site into something more dramatic. So it's not at all unusual for a Romanesque church, especially if it's damaged, if it burns, or even if the people just decide to tear it down and build something better, to be the site upon which a new building will be built. And that's what happened here. The church that was in this position had historically been the burial place of the French kings. We're at Saint Denis. Saint Denis is one of the patron saints of France. And this is just a little bit outside of the city of Paris, but still within what is known as the Ile-de-France, or the main area that the kings, who had their capital, of course, in Paris, the main territory that they controlled. So this is their ancestral burial place. It's a really important church, and Abbot Suger, when he took over, wanted to create something really impressive. And you can see in this aerial view that the cathedral is a cross shape. You can see the round apse end with tons of flying buttresses around the outside to support everything. This is our western end, our entrance. You can even see buttressing along the walls here on this side as well. The main feature to really look for, though, the part that really set this church apart, is what you're seeing here on the inside. This is the apse. This area is known as the choir. So there's the main altar and the space behind it known as the choir. Around here are our radiating chapels. But you notice that they're not apsidal anymore. They're not individual rooms with walls on three sides and a round entrance. What you're now seeing is an open floor plan with elaborate vaulted webbing that really allows the space to allow an enormous amount of light in, even at the ground level, as well as at the clerestory level. So you can see that from the interior, it makes your eye soar up these columns to the ribs in between the vaulting sections, and you can see that the enormous amount of glass that's in this space instead of stark, it really makes the church appear to be completely lit with glorious, glorious color. And Suger had some ecclesiastical reasons for doing this. He really believed in the transformative effect of light and the religious symbolism of light. You could even think of the cathedral in a way as a symbol to God in heaven. I mean, it looks like a cross. If you're in heaven looking down on it, there's that aspect. If you're a human entering it, it's taller than anything else that you've ever been inside of, and it forces your eye up toward heaven, toward where this glorious color is coming at you from light that's passing through the stained glass. So it is literally transforming the experience of the person inside of it. It's unlike any other building that you could experience. Check out the elaborate webbing on these radiating chapels, and you can really see how this is a new advancement made possible by the pointed arch. The ribbing and the vaulting allows us to, instead of having separate individual chambers for these altars or reliquaries, we now have a framework that feels like the whole ambulatory is something that you can walk through in a more open way. It's a really beautiful structure. So some key points to be able to help you recognize the Abbey Church of Sundane. There's no tower at the crossing, so that should help. There is an ambulatory of radiating chapels that's open because of the ribbed vault, and the sections are divided primarily into quadripartite, four-part vaults. Look for pointed arches. On the interior, we just have a three-part elevation, a nave arcade, no gallery, triforium, and clerestory, so allowing us more and more space for the windows. I wanted to give you a better shot of the interior. So let me just pull up 360 view. The Church of Sundane. I just wanted us to have a look at it in a couple different views. Here we are in the nave, looking toward the apse, and you can see how just glorious this building is. Look at how it draws your eye up. It feels enormous to the Romanesque in terms of its height, but it's less dark and cold. It feels gloriously filled with light. So we're right at the crossing. You can see one of the rose windows here to the left. So we're doing the vaulting directly overhead, so you can really get the ribs coming to a point. This is from corner to corner, and that's one of your diagonal ribs. Here, a transverse rib. So it divides into 4 units. You see that happening really within the. We don't have a vaulting crossing with a. So bring us back down here. So the main body of the church is pretty impressive in terms of height, in terms of the elevation and the ribbing. Beautiful. There's arcade, triforium, and our clerestory. But I also wanted you to have a look inside these incredible chapels. There we go. So you can see this is our ambulatory, but instead of it being a narrow hallway with individual chambers separated from each other because of this incredibly gorgeous arch ribbing system, which essentially divides these units into 4, except for apsidal areas where the individual relics are, and those sections are divided into 5. So, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Such a different feeling. I know I've seen a church quite like this before, and you can see how it opens the whole space up and allows it to about verticality and about light. And that's really the innovations of the High Gothic style. Okay. Some of the stained glass, which is a little bit closer up. And again, remember that this glass holding individual pieces of glass in between. The glass can be clear, sandwiched around gold, or it could be painted. Sometimes the glass is infused with color. Another gorgeous early Gothic church for us to take a look at really has all the features of the true early Gothic because it has a 4-part elevation, is Amiens Cathedral. Amiens Cathedral definitely is taller. It also is longer. The units in this case have their divisions crossing 2 bays. So you'll see that it creates kind of less tight feeling in the ceiling. It starts to make the space in the ceiling feel a little bit wider, so it draws your eye along horizontally as well. The church also is much more decorative on the exterior. You see that the portals, the entrances, are much, much deeper now, almost like they're funneling you into the doors. You see elaborate rose window and a lot of decorative architecture happening there as well on the front. So Amiens Cathedral is definitely one of the more impressive ones in our early Gothic example. Key features to look for: 2 huge towers on the west fork, very deep recessed entrances. That's pretty easy to recognize there. The vault system divides into 6 parts, and those 6 parts cover 2 bays each. You'll definitely see rib vaulting with pointed arches. We've got a 4-part elevation: nave arcade, tribune gallery, the triforium, and the clerestory, and we've definitely gotten taller. We're now at an 80-foot height to the highest point on the interior. I wanted you to have a chance to look at this one on the inside too in a different way, so bear with. Okay, here is Amiens Cathedral. So I want us to take a look from the crossing. It's taking a second to load. There we go. So looking upward, you can really clearly see there's my nave arcade right here. You can even see someone leaning over in the gallery. Triforium above that, and that fourth level is the windows. So then if we look for a transverse arch, follow a pier or column upward, there's a transverse arch that goes across. The next transverse arch is not at the next column, the column after that. So that's two bays, two sets of windows, or two entrances on the gallery, two entrances on the nave arcade, two bays, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units. That's a sexpartite wall. Not even more clear. I think we can go directly above the crossing. There we go. 1, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm trying to bring us down again. There we go. You can see the inside of a rose window at the crossing there. And then back toward the entrance. Beautiful. Here's the front, just so you get a good view of that. You can really see how deeply recessed those entrances are and how enormous the towers are in that view. Right. There's the recessed entrances at Amiens Cathedral. So when you're looking head on at the central one, it may not be as obvious, but when you look at the depth on the sides, you can really see how very, very deep those entrances. There's a rose window at the apse area. This is Chartres Cathedral next, one of the most important transitional churches. This one really literally transitions us from the early Gothic to the high Gothic. So this particular church, the original church that was constructed, in fact burned in a fire. So the original building was begun, the west end was completed about 1145, and about 50 years later in 1194 there was a massive fire, and so most of the building was destroyed, but the facade on the west remained, and so that is essentially original to the original plan. Now this church housed a pretty important relic. It in fact was the housing space for the relic of the tunic of Mary, the garment that is believed to be what she was wearing when she gave birth to Christ. And when the building burned, it was that the tunic had been lost along with it, and it was miraculously discovered unharmed. And so the belief was that this church, obviously dedicated to Mary, in fact, it is often called Notre Dame de Chartres, Our Lady of, and then the place name, the city Chartres. It is believed that the fact that the tunic survived the fire is sort of Mary saying she wants a bigger and better church to house the relic. And so it kind of funded this, let's make the church better, let's make it bigger. So we can look at the front of the church as having kind of early Gothic style, but the interior of it being true high Gothic. And so when we look at the high Gothic, you'll see that we have a three-part elevation. We've gotten rid of the gallery. You've got our nave arcade, triforium, and glorious stained glass windows. Again, you can see that the cross shape is really evident, and the towers at the westwork are pretty dominant, just those two spaces, but we have an enormous amount of buttressing, especially on the nave and around the apsidal end of the church itself. So this is definitely one of the most important churches we can look at. In fact, Chartres also founded one of the first cathedral schools before the big medieval push for universities. It was a center of learning, a center of faith, a center of politics. You can see pretty simply in this floor plan, four-part vaulting across each bay as we move toward the crossing space, and you can see radiating chapels here at the apsidal end of the church. So keep looking for two pointed towers at the west facade, look for ribbed vaults, look for quadripartite vaults, look for pointed arches, and a three-part elevation, nave arcade, triforium, clerestory, and also a massive increase in height. We're now looking at a church that's 120 feet high at the highest point of the nave. So let's take a look at it on the interior. Notre Dame de Chartres. So we're now in the nave near the crossing looking toward the apse, and you can really see that glorious blue that the Chartres Cathedral stained glass is known for. It's so beautiful on the inside. From the ground level, here's one bay again, right? In between two columns is one bay, and in this space we have a transverse rib that goes from bay to bay directly across, and we have diagonal ribs going from corner to corner, dividing the bay vaulting into four parts, so quadripartite pointed arch ribbed vaults. Our elevation is quite simply nave arcade, decorative triforium, and then incredibly beautiful glass. You can also see in this church that it's pretty color on the interior. And don't you feel tiny? Look at the size of the shape of the church. They just keep getting bigger and bigger as we go forward. Stained glass. And there's from the main entrance. So those entrances will also start to get a little more dramatic as well. Notre Dame de Chartres. We've already talked a little bit about this in earlier lectures, but the piers, the supporting elements, sometimes are single and sometimes are compound. And that indicates that we have a lot of engaged columns. Essentially, they're decorative, really, but it does create a visual difference. So this gives you a cross-section of what a compound pier is like. They're obviously all attached. It's all a single piece. Essentially what you're looking at, though, is this idea that on the outside, the exterior looks like lots of little columns all put together. That's your compound pier. Outside the church, the flying buttress is the part that is essentially a simple rib or arch that goes out to hold the support. We can call this upright either an upright buttress to distinguish it from the flying buttress, or you could call that a pier. The lancet windows are the ones that are very, very tall and pointed, but very, very narrow. The leading, and you can see this is a contemporary artist making a stained glass window, the leading is thin strips of lead that are bent and used to hold glass in place. So those black lines that you see in the designs are the lead. In England, we'll see a different kind of vaulting, so I just wanted to introduce that term here. We'll look at it in more depth when we get to England, but fan vaulting is really wildly different from what we're going to see in the rest of France, so just be mindful that this is coming. This is the entrance, the royal portal, the entrance to Chartres Cathedral, and already I'm sure you can recognize Christ in the Second Coming, surrounded by the four evangelists, right? We have the human figure, angel figure, lion, ox, and eagle. So those are the four evangelists, the authors of the four books of the Gospels. So we really can see a kind of dramatic change in the storytelling that's happening here. We have the Christ returning, but not necessarily damning souls. It's a little more friendly than some that we saw in the Romanesque. On the left is an interesting thing. This is now being interpreted to be Christ before he takes human, before he becomes incarnate. So this is the before. So we read from left straight across to the right to Mary, who's holding the Christ child, and then back to the center, Christ coming back. So it's sort of his whole life story before birth on earth and then coming back again. You can certainly see that the sculptures themselves do not have the kind of proportions that we became accustomed to in Greece and in Rome. Still, the heads are a little bit large. The drapery doesn't really conform to believable bodies. That's certainly true in the sculptures in the jambs. Remember, the sculptures at the edges of the door are called the jamb sculptures, and they are enormously too skinny and tall for real human proportions. But I also really like the fact that their feet don't seem to really rest on the ground. They're kind of pointing downward. And we saw the effect really all the way back in the Justinian and Theodora mosaics, that sense of occupying real space was less important than the symbolic meaning of the figures. This is the north transept. We actually saw this from the inside, but you can see one of the north windows there. The north portal, deeply, deeply recessed, so you can see that the transept, the crossing aisle, has entrances on either side, and they are much deeper. These are the high Gothic style. See how much different that is from where we just were at the very front, the west style, the early Gothic style. And you can really see that when we look at the decorators themselves. Evolved, don't they look more like the correct proportions of human beings? Even the jamb sculptures start to look so much more believable. Probably the one that most people ooh and ah over is this figure, St. Theodore, who almost is a completely freestanding three-dimensional sculpture in, look, contrapposto pose, almost. It's still not completely perfect, but we're so much closer to the styles that we had in the classical era. You can still see that there are some strange distortions happening. We're not going to completely get to the Renaissance yet, but here we are in the year 1215. We're only a couple hundred years from the birth of the Renaissance. And you can really see especially looking at the feet, don't they look like they're now standing on something instead of pointing downward? You can actually see that in that figure of Christ. Chartres Cathedral, Notre Dame de Chartres. This is the Notre Dame de la Belle Verrière. This woman of the beautiful window. So this is an early Gothic window that times. And these are the high Gothic windows. This is the Good Samaritan window. Much more detail in the body as well, even in stained glass. There's the tunic of the Virgin at the far right. Rose window from the north transept. So again, these are the ones from the more deeply recessed entrances. Okay, so moving on to true high Gothic. So a building that also is built over time. Notre Dame in Paris. We just saw the Chartres Cathedral. This is Our Lady of Paris. So in the cathedral in Paris, this is begun in the late 1160s. 1163 is the beginning of the construction. Our choir, the end where the altar is and the radiating chapels, is complete by about 1182, and the majority of the initial work on the nave and its buttresses is done by the year 1200. So that section really is the high Gothic. It does get remodeled and the work does continue. The facade itself is not completed completed in 1260, but I've given you a date of 1200 there for the main body of the church to secure it within the High Gothic style. You definitely can see some changes happening on the interior. We have a 3-part elevation instead of a 4-part, so we are definitely getting that elongated height. You can see looking down on it from above, absolutely it is a cross shape, but the buttressing is even more elaborate. Of course, part of that was remodeled and it was continued to be built on, so it does get more and more elaborate over time. There's a pretty dramatic pointed tower over the crossing section as well. So when you look for distinguishing features with Notre Dame in Paris, 2 fairly symmetrical towers at the west facade, very tall, very narrow pointed tower crossing, lots of obvious flying buttresses, all especially along the apsidal end of the church around the radiating chapels. It has 6-part nave vaulting, and that 6-part vaulting covers 2 bays each with ribbed vaults, pointed arches. So the elevation, the nave elevation at Notre Dame, the original elevation does change. Right near the crossing, you'll see that you have a nave arcade, a tribune gallery, then an oculus window, and then lancet windows above that. That gets redesigned for the main body of the nave, and that nave arcade, nave elevation rather, breaks down to just the nave arcade, tribune gallery, and clerestory without this oculus window in between. So you can see here, original design, nave arcade, gallery, oculus, the nave arcade, gallery, clerestory. The church is also getting taller. This is 115 feet now at the highest point of the nave on the interior. So let's see if we can take a look at Notre Dame in person. We are in Notre Dame in Paris, and we're in the nave looking toward the apse, and you can see right here in this first shot, nave arcade, gallery, and then these circular windows separated from clerestory windows. So that's the original elevation. And I suppose you could argue that the oculus window and the clerestory window really makes one level, but it is visually 4 separations. We'll start to see how that changes as we get away from the crossing. So you can see here in the transept, we're in the nave looking ahead, but you can see the transept is happening left to right across your screen. You can definitely see the change right there. Nave arcade, this is the ground level looking upward. There's the gallery, and then now this feels more unified, doesn't it? All of this, 2 lancets and an oculus above, as opposed to this big stone oculus and then window here. So this really is the true high Gothic style happening within Notre Dame in Paris. You can also see here, if I position myself this way, 2 entrances to the side aisle through the nave. 2 entrances here in the gallery. So we're looking from this pier straight across the bay, across the nave. There's a transverse arch. You see another transverse here. And then you see diagonals here, right? And a transverse in the middle. So we're dividing this section across 2 bays into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts. 6-part or sexpart type vaulting, and that continues all the way down the main section of the nave. Get us back to the ground so we can orient again. We're looking back to the main body arch. The entrance. You can see a rose window there. Notice how much less stone there is in between the glass. The vertical height of the building, It's an incredibly impressive space. And look how vast it is as we look toward the apsidal end. Just a glorious building. Again, here's the front, and that's our early example as well. The back clearly shows the importance of the buttressing to support the structure, but you can see how the wall itself is almost entirely glass in between those supporting elements. The tops of your supporting buttresses, the vertical buttresses, are what I like to call the piers. The top is called the pinnacles, an opportunity for us to add more decorative elements every which. And you can even see here the gargoyles, which some of them act as rainspouts as well. So every conceivable place that you could put sculpture, the Gothic architects would do so. This is the interior at night. We were just inside it. This is from a little bit further back. You can see the transept crossing there. You can recognize that by the oculus. Just a beautiful church. This is one of the, so even less amount of stone in between there, more glass. This is the north rose window. And you can see how that importance of blue and red really does take over as we get into even later windows. This is from a church that we'll look at in a moment known as Saint-Chapelle. It's one of the most glorious examples of stained glass that I can show you. Again, we've looked, of course, at the leading, holding the individual cut pieces of glass in place. The statuary we can talk about associated with Notre Dame definitely has more of a three-dimensional quality and a sense of a body underneath the garments. As we move forward, we're now in the true high Gothic style as we head into Amiens Cathedral, and Amiens is beginning to get us into a more elaborate decorative style. You can really clearly see that here. Look at how deeply recessed the entrances are, how incredibly elaborate and tall this element is. This section in a cathedral decoration, almost fully three-dimensional standing figures across horizontal bands, usually known as the King's Gallery. More often than not, it is intended to show you ancestors of Christ and or prophets, but on occasion they can be royalty of the culture that you're looking at. You can definitely see the support buttresses and the flying buttresses here along the side. This church is not quite as long, but it's definitely going for even more height, and you can see that on this shot interior. So some distinguishing features to help you tell apart ones. For one, we know the name of the architect. This was the work of Robert de Lussarches, Thomas de Cormont, and Renan de Cormont. These were the architects responsible for the construction of this cathedral, completed roughly around the year 1220. Two big towers at the main facade with incredibly deeply recessed, elaborate portal entrances. Very large sculptures below the rose window in that gallery of kings. We have very large flying buttresses all along the nave and, of course, at the apsidal end as well, but the nave are the most obvious in this photograph. We've got ribbed vaulting, four-part vault over a single bay, and you can see that in the diagram here of the floor plan. So primarily just transverse arches between the supports and then alternating diagonal across from side to side. The church is now much taller. It's 144 feet in height, so it's another, 30 feet almost higher than Notre Dame in Paris. Pretty incredible. Let's take a look inside Amiens. Oh, blackboard's hanging up here. Okay, we'll call this part 1, and I'll try to continue recording later.